So we're going to start talking about the political realignment in the 1930s. And I'm basing a lot of this off of this book called From Bible Belt to Sun Belt: Plain Folk, Religion, Grassroots Politics, and the Rise of Evangelical Conservatism by Darren Dochuk, who's a professor at Notre Dame. And I think the Bible Belt to Sun Belt is a nice way to keep this, what's happening in mind. So keep that phrase in your head. So in the 1930s, as you may or may not know, there was an economic depression in the United States. And the response of the administration that took over in 1932, the administration of FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, what was called the New Deal. It was a massive government program to address the depression, basically by having the government put in a lot of money into the economy, provide people with the jobs and that sort of thing. It was, in sum, a tremendous expansion of federal power. The 1930s brought things like Social Security that hadn't existed before the 1930s, a program that was designed to help older people, once they retired, have enough money to live on after they stopped working. For at least some people, the New Deal was exactly that. It was a New Deal. They were incredibly excited about it. But others really worried about the expansion of federal power. They worried that any time the federal government expands, it takes away freedom, it takes away liberty, it tries to have control. Some of this may sound very familiar at the moment. So there was a deep concern by some people about the expansion of federal power. There was, on the other part, relief for some people that the federal government was expanding. Now, a couple of caveats. I want to just note here that the New Deal was, like many programs in the United States, not equally distributed, particularly in the American South. Black people had a really hard time getting relief from a lot of New Deal programs because they were administered locally. Eleanor Roosevelt, Franklin Delano Roosevelt's wife, really wanted the New Deal to be racially equal, but in order to get it passed, FDR allowed a lot of the programs to be administered locally, which means that African Americans wouldn't have as much access to them. It's also the case that for a lot of people, white people in the South, the New Deal was kind of a compromise position for them. They recognized that they were in a time of financial exigency. They needed some help. They thought that as an emergency measure, the New Deal was appropriate. But they were not convinced that having an expansive federal government was a good thing long term. They really saw the New Deal as something needed for an economic emergency, and that once that economic emergency was over, the federal government should again retract. That's part one. Then in the 1940s, we had World War II. The United States entered the war in the early 1940s, and with the war came a lot of government jobs in industries for military buildup, building ships, building armaments, those sorts of things. And a lot of those industries, not all of them, but a lot of them were located in the Sun Belt states, going back to Dochuk's title. Places like Arizona, New Mexico, and most importantly, Southern California, the Sun Belt. There were a lot of people who moved from the Bible Belt, the American South, particularly the western part of the American South, to the Sun Belt to work in these new jobs related to the military buildup. And then even after the war was over, because of the Cold War, these jobs remained. And you had people working to build airplanes and ships and all of those sorts of things, again, in the Sun Belt. A lot of the people moving for these jobs were Southern Democrats. And here, let me just say what may or may not be obvious to you. In the South, at this time, really the only functional party was the Democratic Party. White people in the South were Democrats. Why were they Democrats? Well, Abraham Lincoln was a Republican. So the Democratic Party was really the one party of the South. What that meant, though, was that the Democratic Party, as a nationally, wasn't the liberal party, and the Republican Party, nationally, wasn't necessarily the Conservative Party. Both parties had political spectrums. A lot of white Southern Democrats were really fairly politically conservative, and there were such things as, say, progressive or liberal Republicans nationally. So the white people who move to the Sun Belt in the 1940s are, for the most part, conservative white Democrats. And again, they're not conservative for Democrats. We're not talking about, I don't know, pick your conservative white Democrat, Tim Kaine, right? We're talking about people who are actually conservative who are also Democrats. They move to the West. And I'm going to pick on California because that's where the story really is. When they move west, they encounter a new kind of Democratic Party, not the Democratic Party of the American South, but the Democratic Party of Southern California. And it was a very different Democratic Party. It wasn't conservative, it was much more liberal. Many Democrats in Southern California liked the expansion of federal power that the New Deal had brought, and they thought that it should remain. That was part of their political position, that the federal government should take more of a role in intervening in the economy to make it, as they understood it, more just. Also, many Democrats in Southern California were more racially egalitarian than, say, the Democratic Party of the American South. So as part of what they wanted the federal government to do was to make the economy more racially just. For a lot of the white Southern Democrats who moved to the Sun Belt for government jobs or government-related jobs in the 1940s into the 1950s, this was not the Democratic Party they knew and loved. They did not like the idea of continuing federal intervention, and they certainly did not think the government should be intervening for racial equality. These erstwhile Southern Democrats began to develop new religious and political networks, much more conservative ones. And they began to leave the Democratic Party and go in places like California to the Republican Party. They began to affiliate now with people who, that party of the blasted Lincoln, but were starting to make that party look more like one they were comfortable with. One that, again, really did not want the federal government intervening in economics and did not want the federal government intervening in race relations. California, again, here isn't the only place this is happening, but it's a key place because the Republican Party that emerges in California is one that is going to bear the imprint of these new networks of the converted white Southern Democrats, already conservative Republicans in California who want to make the Republican Party a more national party, one that can go into the South and be successful there, and one that is more conservative more consistently. There's also, though, a religious realignment happening. Yet again, we've talked about this one, so I won't belabor it, but the 40s and 1950s were a time of religious realignment. Remember, we talked about this last week. You get the rise of what we call the evangelicals, the people associated with primarily the evangelist Billy Graham and the National Association of Evangelicals. These were people, again, who in the 1920s might have affiliated with fundamentalism, but in the 1940s began to reject at least the separatism of fundamentalists. They didn't like the sense that they were not culturally influential, and they wanted to be able to make common cause with other groups when they had the same goals in mind. So let me explain what I mean by that. Fundamentalists really believe that unless you agreed with somebody on everything, you shouldn't work with them. Evangelicals, although they might believe all of the fundamentals of the faith, believe that if you had the same goal, you could work with people with whom you theologically disagreed on that goal. So, for example, Billy Graham went to New York to lead what was then called a crusade, or we might call a revival. He worked with more liberal groups in New York because they too wanted a revival. He was willing to work with them as long as they didn't ask him to compromise his religious beliefs or positions. People who remained fundamentalists thought Billy Graham had sold out. They thought that he had just beyond gone off and had done something terrible because he was willing to work with these liberals. Graham thought, as an evangelical, that as long as he was maintaining his position, his theological positions, he could work with people. If they were willing to hold a revival, he would work with them on that. So we have evangelicals and fundamentalists coming in the 1940s, 1950s. Again, we have the Protestant mainline, those groups of churches that allow for more theological diversity. However, in the 1950s, for at least a lot of people, there was an appearance of shared goals and objectives. This goes back to the Herberg article that we read. Looking at the United States in the 1950s, if you were, say, a white Presbyterian, it would be somewhat easy to assume that most people were basically on board with the religious project of the time. That people wanted a religious nation. They believed religion was a good thing. They wanted people going to church, or at least to church or to synagogue. They wanted people to believe in God. They wanted people to oppose those ungodly communists. That basically there was a national project people were on board with. Now, was that true? As we'll see, it was not. But for a lot of people in the 1950s, it at least looked that way. It seemed like that was possible. One of the things, though, that was happening in the 1950s that will become important is that things were happening abroad that for some segment of the American population are going to become very important. Countries that had lived under colonialism were beginning to say, we're not going to be colonial nations anymore. Nations were becoming communist, most particularly China became a communist country. So underneath this kind of shared, the United States is going to lead the world in democracy and capitalism is basically good and we're basically on track, there were rumblings. But for a lot of people, they weren't clear yet. They still in the 1950s had a sense that religiously we're sort of about the same thing. And then the 1960s happened. The 1960s showed that whatever apparent consensus there had been in the 1950s was only that. It was apparent. There were a lot of divisions within American society, and they became quite clear in the 1960s. So what happened? Well, I'm going to start here down at this corner. One thing that happened was the civil rights movement. The clamor of African Americans specifically, but other groups as well, for civil rights. That was going to be a huge change in the country, and we're going to talk about that more in just a second. Another change came with some court rulings related to school prayer and Bible reading. Most specifically, in 1962, the Supreme Court ruled that school prayer was unconstitutional. Now, I want to be really clear what I mean here by school prayer, because sometimes you'll see people say, you can't, children can't pray in school. A child, if that child wants to, can pray in school. No one's going to stop a child from bowing their heads and praying. What was ruled unconstitutional was teacher-led prayer or mandated prayer. The Supreme Court ruled that that violated disestablishment. For a lot of conservatives, as we'll see here, however, what this seemed to violate was free exercise as well as a sense of the nation's religious foundation. Other things that happened in the 1960s, the counterculture, a revolt against authority, a revolt against the kind of bourgeois lifestyle of the 1950s. And then the sexual revolution. Here, sometimes related to the counterculture, things like the rise of the feminist movement, and then, as we'll see in the 1970s, really the gay rights movement, as well as the Roe v. Wade decision of 1973. So, that was all a lot, so let me just walk you through that. Starting in the 1930s, you had a huge uptick in government intervention. You also had a movement of people out of the American South into the Sun Belt who began to disassociate from the Democratic Party and align more with the Republican Party. And you got the beginnings of a Republican Party who began to see a way of getting back into the American South and being able to win elections. In the 1950s, as that's going on, you still have what for many people seems like a consensus around religion, even though there are splits between fundamentalists and evangelicals and mainliners. What we now know is there's a lot of rumbling underneath that surface, but to a lot of people, it seemed like there was consensus. The 1960s blows that consensus apart. All of the cracks in the consensus become, well, not all, maybe not all of them, but many cracks in that consensus become very clear. And court rulings and new movements began to show, at least to some Americans, that the America that they thought they had was not the America that was present or was what a lot of their fellow citizens wanted.